Okay, so here we have the blue edition of the Game Gear. This one was actually sent in for repair service to install the RetroSix, clean screen, fully recapped, and cleaned out. So let's go ahead and see what we got here. So got the usual no display, as you can barely see. We got a few lines here and there once we power it on, but at least it powers on. So I will go ahead, open this thing up, and we'll go see what's happening inside. Okay, once we removed all the screws, let's go ahead and open it up. So you're gonna have the audio board here. So just pop those cables out, pop the speaker cable out, and the power board here. And you're gonna go ahead and pop that out. And I usually go ahead and do the main board first to go ahead and recap it. Now I normally keep the main board inside the shell for now, so that way once I fully recap it, I can give it a quick test to make sure all the buttons work correctly and that we have a good picture, or at least the console read the games. Usually it doesn't matter if the screen doesn't work correctly as long as it shows some image, if you're going to replace the screen with the RetroSix or MicWheel mod, whatever mod you need. So let's go ahead and start taking all these caps off. Now the way I like to do it, I usually loosen up these caps first. Use a pair of pliers, and you just want to kind of pop them up. Don't want to rip it off the board. I just pop the actual capacitors off the board because they are slightly glued down the main board. That way, once you heat up the solder, you can just pull them right off. So you don't have to work too hard to pry them up. Just kind of loosen them up a little bit, get them nice and ready. Now some will start to come off, but you don't want to force it. So just slightly move it around and crack him off the board here. Now I usually use hot air to get all the old capacitors off. Now normally you do not want to use hot air on capacitors, or on the new capacitors at least, because they will pop. And since these are old and they do have the plastic protection around them, they generally do not get too much heat. You just want to focus your heat around the solder joints here on the back. Okay, so you want to go ahead and get the fume extractor going here. You do not want to breathe that old fumes that come off of these capacitors. It is very stinky and probably not good for you either. I do have this homemade vent that sucks all of it out. Just a 12-volt fan, hot glued inside a pipe, and then that just goes out the window, or a vent leading outside. So it will not be smelling in here, and I will not be breathing that. So let's go ahead and heat up my hot air, and I usually have the fan set to low, and you just want to focus on the capacitors here. Once the fan heats up, they'll start coming out really quick. Now you can use your soldering iron, but like I said, for me this is just faster versus picking each of the capacitor legs one at a time. I'll just heat the board up and they'll start popping right off. You can use flux if you want. That will get it working a bit better or faster, but it works just fine without flux. Now for this capacitor, you want to be careful not to use too much hot air, because it's really close to this connector here, the power connector. You do not want to melt that. What I usually do is just grab a little bit of aluminum tape. Okay, so you grab a little bit, a small piece of aluminum tape, and just stick it right in between the capacitor and that connector. Okay, finally got it in there. And you just want to work X-Acto knife or something small in there and make sure it's tucked in there. And also put a little bit on the volume knob here, because you do not want to melt it either. Now if you're going to be installing a new screen on here, the McQuill or the RetroSix or any other, you don't really have to worry about protecting this power module here. But if you'll be keeping the original screen, you just want to recap it, then you're going to put a little piece of tape here. You don't want to ruin the power module here, as this is the backlight module. If you ruin that, then you will not have any backlight. Alright, so once you got that taped off, just give it some hot air. You want to warm up the board a little bit first, prevent heat shock. And just lift it up a little bit. Put some hot air underneath it, and it should pop right off. You don't want to give it too much force. You want to read the pads. Just kind of be gentle, but don't take too long, as you don't want to apply too much heat in that one area. Okay, once all of the capacitors are removed, what I usually like to do first is clean all the pads from the old capacitors and pre-tin them. So I apply a little bit of flux on all the pads here. That way the solder melts nicely and quickly. And make sure your fume extractor is on. You don't want to be breathing any of that in. And just kind of give it a quick dab. And get all that old gunk out. Once you cleaned all the pads, what I like to do is add a little bit of new solder. Just pre-tin them really quick. Add a small dab to each pad. So when you put the new capacitor in, you just add a little bit of heat and it will flow right in. Okay, so once you went over all the pads, I have a RetroSix Gamegear capacitor kit. And you can buy these on their website or on eBay. These are the ceramic caps. They also come with the electrolyte capacitors for the power supply. Okay, so let's go ahead and start putting on the new capacitors. I'm gonna go ahead and start with the 1 microfarad here. These go on C55 and C54. And I'm gonna use hot air here. Set fan speed to low. You can use a soldering gun, but I like to use hot air on here. So add some more flux. Like I said, flux is your friend. Makes the job so much easier. Just warm the area up a little bit. Don't want to apply too much heat to just one surface area. So drop that in there. Now once the soldering starts melting, it will just grab the capacitor right in its place. You can guide it in a little bit, but it will get right in there. Perfect. Let's grab the second one. You can always touch these up with a soldering gun later on if you want, but the gun works just fine. Now I'm gonna try using the soldering gun on few if you don't have the hot air. Okay, so let's go ahead and move on to the 10 microfarads, and there will be 5 of them. So it'll be C45, C4, I believe, C11, C66, and C42. So these are a little bigger, so a little easier to work with. And I'm gonna apply a few with the soldering gun just to see. It's a bit tricky, but it's doable, because you have to do one side at a time. So let's go ahead and put this one in here. These are really small, so just guide it into place. And just like that, it'll be okay. So I'm gonna go back to hot air here, and I'll put in the rest of them. So it's basically the same process for each one. You just want to make sure that you are putting them in the right place. Now polarity does not matter for ceramic capacitors. You just want to make sure it's the right voltage and the right microfarads. Okay, so that's all the capacitors. So we're gonna go ahead and move on to the power supply. But before I move on to the power supply, I want to give this a nice clean, remove all the old flux to have a nice clean board, and it will also dry out a little bit by the time you're working in the power supply. So I use some ISO, dip your brush in there, and just give it a good clean. Scrub it around. So once you give it a good scrub, what I like to do is put a napkin over top and scrub it down a little more. So that removes all the excess ISO, and it also picks up all the dirt. Now you're gonna have a nice clean board. Okay, so once this is out, we're gonna go ahead and replace these capacitors. Now this is what usually causes the no power issue, or if your console powers on and then powers right back off after a few seconds. A capacitor is usually what's causing the problem. It could also be the power IC here. These can also be replaced, and they're also available at the RetroSix website. But I would say 90% of the time it's the capacitors. So let's go ahead and remove these. I'm going to be using a wick and soldering gun, and just wick all the excess solder off, and the capacitors should just fall right out. Okay, so once all those are removed, let's go ahead and put in the new ones. And like I said, pay attention to polarity. You do not want to reverse these. So just push those through. Now you want to do one at a time, or you can put all of them in. Because sometimes they do slide out once you flip it upside down. So let's go ahead, add a little bit of flux. And put them in place. Okay, and then you're gonna want to cut off all the excess leads. All right, so once the board has all new capacitors, let's go ahead and put it back in. We're just gonna wanna give it a quick test with the new capacitors on the board, on the power board, and the new capacitors here on the main board. So let's go ahead, plug all that in and see what happens. So it works pretty good. Let me go turn the light off, turn it down at least. There we go. So we got a pretty good picture. Brightening works not too bad. There is a bit of a damage here on the side, but we're not too worried about the screen, as we're gonna be tossing that out anyway. So all right, let's power it back off. Okay, so now we know everything works pretty good. So we're gonna go ahead and work on the power board, or I'm sorry, the soundboard. Go ahead, disconnect that. So we need to go ahead and take off this metal shield here, because we actually need to cut it down anyway. So let's go ahead and remove that. Now with the shield and the soundboard removed, let's go ahead and remove the capacitors here on the soundboard. Now the best and the easiest way to remove these is actually with pliers. Now you don't want to just pull them out, because you will rip the pads and you're just going to create a lot more work for yourself. So what you actually want to do is, with the pair of pliers, just take them, squeeze it, and twist it back and forth slowly, and they'll just pop right off. So you're essentially just breaking the legs off. So you want to go ahead and just do it to all of them. It's really hard to actually try to desolder them off the board. At first I was doing that and it just took forever, and because it's really hard getting underneath these, because the legs are basically right underneath and they are almost like surface mounted, so they are a pain. So just go ahead and twist all of these off, nice and easy. And once you removed all the capacitors, you can take a X-Acto knife or some small needle head pliers and just pry these off. Found that X-Acto knife works the best. Nice and thin, gets right underneath there, and just comes right off. Okay, once all the capacitors are removed, what you want to go ahead and do again is add some flux to all the pads here, and clean them out. So you just basically go over them with the soldering gun, soldering iron. Get your fume extractor on, and just go over all the pads until all pads are nice and shiny and clean. Okay, I added the aluminum tape again to the plastic connectors, as you don't want to melt them, because I'll be using hot air again to put all the capacitors on. So it gets hot, you don't want to melt it. All right, and to double stack this one, I'll just go ahead a little bit, add a little bit of more flux. I'm just gonna put it right on the top, and then we're gonna take our soldering gun and just hold it in place, and just give it a nice little dab, and it will grab. Do it from one side and then the other. Touch it up here. All right. So it's gonna look something like this. So all these get one, and this one gets two. All right, so let's go ahead and clean the board with some rubbing alcohol and a toothbrush. Let's go ahead and test, make sure we got good sound. So let's plug in. I have a test speaker here. Plug it in, and we're gonna take the board. I'm gonna plug in this cable here, and let's go ahead and give it some power. All right, so we got Sonic in there. Usually has good audio, good loud audio. So let's go ahead and see. Wait for the boot. There we go. Works nicely. Volume works. Nice and loud. All right. So everything checks out. Okay, with everything checking out and seems to be working good with all new capacitors, we can go ahead and start preparing for the clean screen install. So I'm gonna go ahead and remove all the screws that's holding the main board down. Okay, so with this board out, I will go ahead and remove the backlight lamp, the screen, and the components over here. All of this is available in the RetroSix instructions if you ever buy the screen or the kit. everything's included, or you can go on their website and the instructions are provided. That way you can follow step by step. But I will go ahead and remove everything. Now for the LCD, to remove it, you want to cut this tape that's holding the screen, just the tape here. You don't want to actually cut the ribbon cable. I will use hot air, so you just put hot air in a little bit and it will come right off. And you want to be careful with this. You don't want to pull too hard. You want to make sure that the solder melts before you pry out the screen, because it's very easy to destroy these pads here. Now you don't need all the pads here. You just need the first few on this side. But either way, you still want to be careful, and you don't want to start pulling the screen too hard without applying proper temperature, because they are very easy to rip. And once you start ripping the pads here, you're still able to fix it. You can use the VS over here, but it's just much easier to work with the pads here. Now with the screen off, I will go ahead and remove the lamp here, the resistors behind the lamp, and these two capacitors and the L2 coil. There's also the R56, R57, R29, and R30 resistors. These little guys right over here. So these 4 resistors need to come off, coil, and 2 capacitors. Alright, so with all those components removed, you want to check for 5 volts. Because if your Game Gear is giving out more than 5 volts, I believe it's like 5.45, then you're going to ruin the clean screen mod. So if you're under 5, say 480, 460, that's perfectly acceptable. So let's go ahead, power this on. And to check, you're gonna check where L2 coil was, the left pin, which is gonna be the VCC, and the ground. So we can just take the ground. So we're at 5 volts exactly. So that's perfect. Alright, so we have all the parts here. We have the driver board, the LCD brackets, and the flex cables. So let's go ahead and put it all together. So this just drops right in there, and you want to make sure that the holes on the driver board line up with the old screen screw holes, because you're gonna be fastening the LCD with screws, and you're going to be using the same screws that you removed from the old LCD. So you're going to be putting it right through the bracket, and it's going to screw right in through here onto this plastic bracket in the back. So I'm going to go ahead and add solder to all the pads here and get it started. Okay, once everything is flowed, we'll solder. Let's go ahead and put in the flex cables. Now what I like to do is solder on the flex cable on the board first. That way I can move it around which way I need to before I finally connect it to the connection points on the Game Gear, because you need to make sure that your holes are properly aligned here with the holes on the Game Gear board, so you're going to be able to screw in the LCD from the back, because if it's misaligned, you're not going to be able to properly put on the aligning bracket for the LCDs. So that's pretty important if you want to have a nice aligned LCD screen. Okay, once your flex cables are soldered on to the to the driver board, let's go ahead and align the board with the holes, with the 4 holes, and now we can secure the flex cable to the board on both sides. So I'll go ahead and do the left side first, so everything is nicely and aligned. You also want to make sure that the backlight cables, which connected the 2 metal pins on this wheel here, are properly aligned as well. So let's go ahead, that looks good, and we'll go ahead and put that in here, and let's go ahead and put that here. Alright, so once this is nice and aligned and secure, let's go ahead and connect everything else. So all we have left are the V-Sync and H-Sync connections. So the way I like to do it here, just add some flux, and this edge cable here, or solder point, is basically just to keep this flex cable in place. So the 2 main important are these 2 pads here. So let's go ahead and add some flux. And we're going to add some solder. Let's turn on our fume extractor. Okay, so here, what I like to do is whenever you install the capacitors, you always cut off the little leads here. So I usually save them, because this is the time when they come in handy. So let's go ahead and cut a smaller little piece here. You can actually use this. Come on. All right. So you take the little piece and you basically bridge the connection together from the flex cable to the pad, to the flex cable. Now you don't want to leave a big blob like that. I'll go ahead and clean my tip. Put it in there, hold it in place, and just tap it slightly. Let's go ahead to the second one. Let's go ahead and add a little bit more flux here. I love my flux. This is Amtac flux that I actually purchased from another YouTuber. He's Northridge Fix. He sells a lot of good stuff. So let's add a little bit more here. Now this basically keeps it in place that way that you're never gonna have to worry about the flex cable breaking away from the pads here. Alright, and I would clean this up with some ISO and then add a bit of electrical tape to keep it in place. Okay, so with the power supply connected, game cartridge inserted, let's go ahead and see what we have. Alright, and we have game. So the brightness works all the way up. Everything looks good. So let's go ahead and secure the screen in place. Alright, so with everything scrubbed and cleaned, it's time to put everything together. Now before we do that, do not forget to cut this little screw post here, because that will or could break the LCD. So usually just take some pliers and snip it right off. Just like that. Now before I proceed to fully close it up, I just want to give a quick test to make sure the screen is properly centered and aligned. So it looks pretty good. Now remember, do not put that security bit back in here, because you will crack the LCD. The LCD is right below this line here. It's actually the ribbon cable. So you'll cut right through the ribbon cable and your LCD is toasted. So do not do that. Alright, here's our lens. So let's go ahead and put that on. Now first, before we take off the protective film on the actual lens, let's take this one off first. The on the body itself. Get that off, and then to eliminate as much as possible dust, we'll go ahead and first take this one off. Be nice and slow and gentle. You don't want no dust or anything getting in there. Well, as you can tell, I'm not the greatest at Sonic, but let's go ahead and test all the buttons and make sure everything works. So if we go VGA out, nice, that works, but we do not have a VGA port out, so then we'll do 1, 2, and start. So start, 1, and 2, and left. That's a lot of buttons to toggle between all the different options available. Alright, everything's good. This is ready to be shipped back. Audio is good. Nice and loud. Wow. Alright.